Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Ted Rollins. Glad to have you along with us on this Wednesday. We are awaiting the jury to come back in the case in Wisconsin. James Propovich is on trial for the murder of his wife. But before we get to that, we got a little breaking news out of the state of Minnesota. The Minnesota Court of Appeals has scheduled oral arguments for Monday, March 1st on the state's appeal to restore third-degree murder charges against Derek Chauvin. Chauvin is the former Minneapolis police officer charged with second-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter in the death of George Floyd. Jury selection for his trial is scheduled to start March 8th. So there is a need to get this expedited. And we, of course, have gavel-to-gavel coverage slated here on Court TV, starting with jury selection on the 8th. Before we get to Wisconsin, let's bring back our guests here. We're also joined by Marcia Minot. Josh Schiffer is still with us. Marcia, thank you for joining us today. The Court of Appeals is saying, all right, we'll listen to it. The state wants third-degree murder charges reinstated. The judge said no. Now it's going to be up to the Court of Appeals. The timing here is pretty tight. March 1st, oral arguments. March 8th is jury selection. What's your initial impression about the Court of Appeals saying, yeah, we're going to listen to it, bring on your oral arguments?
Well, the Court of Appeals has an opportunity to decide whether or not the trial court improperly dismissed that charge. And that's a decision that they can make in a pretty quick manner because it's a legal issue, not a factual issue. So once they decide on that date if that charge should be added back in, it will be pretty simple for the defense and the prosecution to pursue their case as it pertains to the charges.
And Josh, this, it's kind of legalese. It's into the weeds here, inside baseball, however you want to qualify it. It's some would say legal mumbo jumbo. But what the bottom line is the state wants this opportunity to have third degree also on the menu for Derek Chauvin, if you will. And the trial judge in this case, saying it doesn't apply. The facts don't apply to this, and that's why he said that no, it shouldn't be here. What is your take on this and the net effect, and what maybe do you feel like is really going on here? Is this the state just desperately needing all choices for jurors at the end of the day when this trial's over?
Well, I think you've got a bunch of different competing interests, and you're right that this is going into the legal weeds because the functional part that needs to be focused on is actually not this case. It's another case and another ruling that just came out that would support the third degree. And everybody's waiting to find out how the Minnesota Supreme Court is going to interpret that or whether some more process needs to take place. And the state certainly has an interest in the appeal in prosecuting Officer Chauvin that they want to apply the third degree murder. This is a legal issue. It is about how the courts work and the rules. There's no facts involved, as was mentioned. So this can be dealt with quickly. And I won't be surprised if the court finds a way to give the state as much flexibility in charge determination as possible. Remember, we've got the backstop of a jury. If the state doesn't prove the charge, the jury's not going to convict. There's also rules on judges having to consolidate lesser included charges and things like that. So this is some legal mumbo jumbo, and it's not going to stop this trial from going forward. That's what we really need to concentrate on is Minnesota's going to get us some justice.
Well, Marcia, could it, though, delay this trial if the Court of Appeals says, well, we kind of need to hear from the Supreme Court on this? Could the state say to the judge, hey, we need this litigated before we go to trial? Because, frankly, the state and Chauvin both want a continuance in this case, and it was denied by the judge. The state said COVID was the reason, but the judge said, no, we got to plow through here. We want this thing to start on the 8th. What's your take?
To answer your question, yes, it could delay the trial. Because if the Court of Appeals decides that we need to hear from the Supreme Court, or we do need to consider a recent ruling, and if we make a ruling and the state makes an appeal to the Supreme Court from the Court of Appeals, that's definitely going to delay the case. Because the dates of the starting of the trial are so close to the actual Court of Appeals hearing that matter. I also believe that the Court of Appeals is going to rule in favor of the state. And the reason is because, as co-counsel just said, the state has the opportunity to prove the case beyond a reasonable doubt at trial. If the jurors find that the evidence is insufficient, the jurors can find Chauvin not guilty. The court also has the opportunity where it's called a judgment notwithstanding the verdict. So you can move for a directed verdict. When the state rests, the defense can move for a directed verdict stating, Judge, they haven't proved count 1, count 5, whatever counts they believe was not proven. And the trial court still has the opportunity to dismiss those counts before the jury even hears the evidence. So yes, to answer your question, I do believe it will be delayed if the Court of Appeals says we have to hear from the Supreme Court, or if the state appeals the Court of Appeals decision if it's not in their favor.
Again, if you're just joining us, we're talking about a ruling. Well, the Minnesota Court of Appeals will hear oral arguments on March 1st in the Chauvin case. We're not ignoring what's going on in Wisconsin. The attorneys are back in the courtroom there and milling around. We believe that the next witness may be a confidential informant, and if that is the case, we have to turn our cameras off and we can't show that. But Chanley Painter, legal correspondent, is there. She will absorb it all and fill us in on what took place. But there is some sort of a delay going on. We're not positive that that's the case, but there's some milling around in the courtroom, and we have our eyes on that. So once that gets back up and running, we'll get you back into that Green Bay, Wisconsin courtroom. Meanwhile, let's talk about the Chauvin case more, because it is one that we're obviously anticipating here at Court TV, where we'll have gavel-to-gavel coverage starting on the 8th with jury selection. Josh, this is a case that really is, it was a year ago, yes, but not even a year ago. It was something that Minnesotans, especially in this jury pool in Hennepin County, in Minneapolis, they lived this. They watched the death of George Floyd. Then they watched the destruction of their city over the several weeks. How difficult is jury selection going to be in this case?
I think that it's going to be one of the hardest juries to get ever, if you're going to measure it on the standard of, has the jury heard about this? Is the jury aware of this? There's going to be a really small needle hole for the court to thread in order to ensure that the jury pool and the eventually selected jury really is fair and impartial. But the courts can do that. There are mechanics in place. On a bigger kind of stage, the Chauvin case is an existential goalpost for our nation. It is such a central issue that the entire nation was looking at during the beginning of the pandemic. It was probably story number 2 at the time in a year filled with giant stories. And I think the nation is going to be riveted on this. We're talking about a fundamental race relation issue between minorities and the establishment law enforcement. We've got obviously a tragic and horrible death. The community acted throughout the remainder of 2020 in bringing attention to this, and Minnesota needs to, put a pin in it, get a ruling. Without a foundation, they can't move on, and it's basically paralyzed our major cities in how we're going to deal with law enforcement reform in the future. And we've seen that now manifest in elections. We have had huge changes since this happened. I'm betting that of the seminal events of the last 100 years, this trial is going to be at the very top. Everyone knows about it.
Marcia, to Josh's point, the significance of it, the idea that people are watching every minute. Oh, I'm seeing that the jury is being brought in Wisconsin. Why don't we put the George Floyd discussion on hold for now? But again, the breaking news on that front is the Court of Appeals in Minnesota will hear oral arguments on the 1st of March. Jury selection in the Chauvin case scheduled for the 8th of March. What happens in between, we'll have to wait and see, but of course we'll be covering it all here on Court TV, and we'll have full analysis tonight on closing arguments, 8 p.m.
Thank you. You may be
Eastern
seated.
with Vinnie Politan. Let's get back into the courthouse in Green Bay.